You ever have one of those mornings where you wake up thinking it's just another Tuesday, and by lunch you're wondering if the whole world's gone crazy? That's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. Name's Mark Chandler, and if you're watching Karenology, you know things are never as simple as they seem. Picture this, 6:47 a.m., and I'm out in my garage workshop, coffee still steaming on the workbench. I've got this custom drone spread out in pieces. Farmer's kid crashed it into a fence, needed the gimbal rebuilt. The morning air was crisp, smelled like pine needles, and that clean bite of early fall. That's when I heard it, the whirring. I looked up through the garage door, and there's this white drone hovering maybe 30 feet above my roof. Not a toy. I'm talking professional grade, the kind fire departments use. My stomach dropped. Fire drones don't just show up for fun. Mark! The voice came from my fence line, sharp and satisfied. Karen Martinez, my neighbor from 2 houses down. She's standing there in her matching lavender tracksuit, holding up her phone like she's filming the next viral video. There he is! Your illegal factory in action! I stepped out of the garage, still holding my father's old calipers, the steel ones he used when he wired half this neighborhood back in the 70s. Factory? Karen, what are you talking about? She pointed at the drone circling overhead. Fire department's doing an industrial inspection. Turns out your little hobby shop violates about 12 residential codes. My workshop, the place where I fix neighbors' electronics, teach kids robotics on weekends, prototype irrigation sensors for local farms. Factory. The drone descended, its camera lens fixed on my garage like a mechanical eye. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I got 2 years ago when my risk assessment failed and cost 3 people their jobs. When you mess up once in my line of work, people remember. This is ridiculous, I said, but my voice came out shakier than I wanted. I repair drones and teach. And save it for the homeowners association. Karen waved a thick manila envelope. Emergency violation notice, $12,500 in fines, plus you've got 72 hours to remove all industrial equipment. 12.5 grand, 2 months of my income, gone. The envelope landed at my feet with a thud that seemed to echo off every house on Maple Street. Through my peripheral vision, I caught curtains twitching in windows. Mrs. Chen from next door stepped onto her porch, arms crossed. The Rodriguez family slowed their morning jog to a walk, then stopped completely. I picked up the envelope, hands steadier than I felt. The paper was warm from Karen's grip, and I could smell her vanilla perfume mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the courthouse the day I had to testify about my failed assessment. Fear. But here's the thing about fear. Sometimes it's yours, and sometimes it belongs to the person trying to scare you. You sure the fire department requested this inspection? I asked, looking up at the drone. Karen's smile faltered for just a second, just long enough for me to catch it. Of course they did. Industrial chemicals, noise violations, commercial activity in a residential zone. She rattled off the charges like she'd memorized them. This neighborhood has families, Mark. Children. The drone's whirring grew louder as it dropped lower, close enough that I could read the serial number on its belly. Professional equipment, all right. But something felt off about the whole setup. I looked at Karen, then at the envelope, then back at that mechanical eye in the sky. 3 things that didn't quite fit together. Have you ever had that moment where you realize the game's rigged, but you're not sure how yet? That's exactly where I was standing, holding my father's calipers and a $12,000 threat, while a drone filmed what might be the end of everything I'd built. The morning was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The drone finally buzzed away, leaving me standing there with that envelope burning a hole in my hands. I tore it open right there on my driveway, and what I found made my blood run cold. Official letterhead from Allied Property Management, the company that handles half the contracts in our county. Detailed photos of my garage interior, taken with a telephoto lens. Chemical storage violations, noise ordinance breaches, commercial activity in residential zoning. But here's what really got me. The timestamp on the photos was from last Tuesday, 3 days before Karen's emergency inspection. I walked back into my garage, looking at it through their eyes, my 3D printer humming in the corner, bottles of distilled water for cleaning circuit boards, labeled in the report as unidentified chemical storage, my soldering station described as industrial welding equipment. The phone started ringing before I even made it to the house. Mark, this is Jim Patterson. My first cancellation. Patterson's got a 100-acre farm, and I've been maintaining his irrigation drones for 2 years. Listen, buddy, I heard about some trouble with the county. I think it's better if I find another tech. 3 more calls just like it. $8,000 in contracts gone in an hour. Word travels fast in a small town, especially bad word. By noon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of bills and a calculator, trying to figure out how a man goes from helpful neighbor to public menace overnight. The math wasn't pretty. Without those contracts, I had maybe 6 weeks before I'd have to sell the house. That's when the lights went out. Not the whole house, just the garage. I flipped the breaker 3 times before I realized what happened. Someone had called the power company, reported an illegal commercial operation running off residential service. I grabbed my phone and dialed Allied Property Management. This is Mark Chandler on Maple Street. I need to speak to whoever ordered the inspection of my property. Hold, please. Elevator music that sounded like it was being played through a tin can. Mr. Chandler, this is Brad Wilson, Property Compliance Director. I understand you have some questions about your violation notice. Yeah, I have questions, like why Allied Property is inspecting private homes that aren't under your management. Sir, we received multiple complaints from residents about industrial activity in a residential zone. We have a duty to investigate potential safety hazards. Multiple complaints. I'd lived on this street for 8 years, fixed half these people's computers and phones, taught their kids how to build robots. Multiple complaints. Who complained? I'm not at liberty to... Was one of them Karen Martinez? Silence. Then, Mr. Chandler, I'd suggest you focus on resolving these violations rather than questioning our process. 72 hours is not very long. The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same feeling I got when I realized my last risk assessment had missed a critical failure point. When you spend your life looking for problems other people can't see, you develop a sense for when something's wrong with the picture. And this picture was wrong in about 12 different ways. I walked outside and looked up and down Maple Street. Karen's house, 2 doors down, had a for sale sign that wasn't there yesterday. The Hendersons across the street, new for sale sign too. 3 houses, all listed by the same agency. Allied Property Real Estate. You know that feeling when you realize you're not just dealing with a nosy neighbor? When you start to see the edges of something bigger, something planned? I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, the for sale signs. The Allied Property Management truck parked 2 blocks over, the same truck that had been there every morning this week. The fresh surveyor's marks on 3 different properties, marks I'd been too busy to notice before. My workshop wasn't the target, it was the excuse. And Karen Martinez wasn't just a neighbor with a complaint. She was working with someone who wanted my house, and probably half the neighborhood, for reasons I was just starting to understand. The evening air carried the sound of hammering from the construction site across town, the new luxury development that had been stuck in permit hell for 6 months. The same development Allied Property had been trying to get approved since spring. I looked at those calipers in my hand, the ones my father used to measure voltage and resistance, to find problems hiding in plain sight. Time to do some measuring of my own. That evening, I did what any reasonable person would do when facing a $12,000 shakedown. I called my lawyer. Mark, I've looked over your violation notice. Tony Rodriguez had been handling legal work for contractors in our county for 15 years. If anyone could cut through this mess, it was him. The good news is, most of these violations are bogus. The bad news is, fighting them could cost more than just paying the fine. Tony, I don't have 12 grand lying around. I know, but here's the thing. Allied Property Management doesn't usually get involved in code enforcement. That's the county's job. This whole situation stinks like week-old fish. I was sitting in my dark garage, looking at my disabled equipment by flashlight. The smell of soldering flux and machine oil felt like home, but tonight it felt like a tomb. What if I just comply, remove everything, pay the fine, move on? You could, but Mark, I've seen this pattern before. Small towns, established neighborhoods. Suddenly there's a wave of code violations and property complaints. Usually happens right before someone wants to buy up land cheap. There it was, the thing I'd been circling around all day without wanting to face it. You think they're trying to force us out? I think Allied Property Management just happened to find 12.5 grand worth of violations in a garage workshop that's been operating for 3 years without a single complaint. You tell me what that sounds like. I hung up and walked out to my front yard. The street looked different now. Not like home, but like a chessboard where I was just figuring out the game being played. Karen's house was dark, except for the blue glow of a television. The Henderson place had all its lights on, probably having the same conversation I'd just had with Tony. Down the street, old Mrs. Petrov was standing in her garden with a flashlight, pulling up her prized tomatoes like she was getting ready to leave. My phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Emergency Homeowners Association meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. Mandatory attendance. Safety concerns require immediate action. Mandatory. In 8 years of living here, we'd never had a mandatory HOA meeting. I was about to head back inside when I heard footsteps on gravel. Jake Rodriguez, no relation to my lawyer, jogging up from the fire station end of the street. Jake's been a firefighter for 12 years, lives 4 houses down from me. Mark. He slowed to a walk, breathing hard. You got a minute? Sure, though if you're here to tell me my workshop's a fire hazard, you're about 8 hours too late for that conversation. Jake looked around, then stepped closer. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. That drone this morning, the one Karen said was from the fire department? Yeah. We didn't send it. The words hit me like cold water. What do you mean you didn't send it? I mean, I've been on duty for 36 hours, and nobody at our station requested an aerial inspection of your property. Nobody at County Fire either. I checked. I felt something shift in my chest, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Then who? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Jake pulled out his phone, showed me a photo. I took this when the drone was landing. You recognize the logo? I squinted at the image, small white letters on the drone's side. APS, Aerial Property Services. Never heard of them. Neither had I, so I did some digging. Jake's voice got even quieter. APS is a subsidiary of Allied Property Management. They do aerial surveys for real estate development. The night air suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. They hadn't been inspecting my workshop for code violations. They'd been mapping the neighborhood for something else entirely. Jake, how long have those for sale signs been going up? Started about 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Patterson, the Hendersons, now Karen Martinez. All the same realtor. I thought about the surveyor's marks, the construction delays across town, the way Brad Wilson had deflected every question about who'd filed the complaints. They're not trying to shut down my workshop, I said, more to myself than to Jake. They're trying to clear out the whole neighborhood. Jake nodded grimly. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I looked at my father's calipers, still clutched in my hand. For 30 years, he'd used them to find problems in electrical systems, to measure what couldn't be seen with the naked eye, to solve puzzles that could burn down houses if left alone. I'm going to do what my old man taught me, I said. I'm going to find out exactly how much voltage they're running through this operation. Jake clapped me on the shoulder. You need help with that measuring. You know where to find me. As he jogged away, I stood in my driveway looking at my dark garage and thinking about chess games and electrical circuits and the difference between a problem and a symptom. Tomorrow's HOA meeting was going to be very interesting, but first, I had some homework to do. Because if Allied Property Management thought they could run a con game on Maple Street, they were about to learn something about the kind of neighbors they were dealing with. The streetlight above my driveway flickered once, then went steady. Even the power company couldn't keep me in the dark forever. I spent the next morning at the county courthouse, digging through public records like a man possessed. The smell of old paper and industrial coffee filled the basement archive room as I pulled file after file. What I found made my hands shake. Allied Property Management had filed preliminary development plans for our entire neighborhood 6 months ago. Luxury condominiums, retail space, a small shopping complex. The whole project was worth about $15 million. There was just one problem. They needed to acquire at least 12 properties to make the economics work. And according to the county assessor's records, only 3 homeowners had agreed to sell at their offered price. The rest of us? We were what they called holdout properties in their development proposal. Properties that needed to be acquired through alternative means. I photographed every page with my phone, my mind racing. This wasn't just about my workshop. This was about forcing out an entire community so Allied could cash in on waterfront development rights. But here's what really got my attention. The project had been stalled for months because of environmental concerns. Something about drainage and flood risk. The county had required them to submit a comprehensive hydraulic impact study before approving any construction, a study they still hadn't completed. I drove home thinking about drainage patterns and flood zones, about why a company would go to such elaborate lengths to acquire properties they could probably get through eminent domain eventually. Unless there was something about our specific lots they needed that wasn't in the official paperwork. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening at the community center. I got there at 6:30 and found the parking lot already half full. Karen's car was there, along with Brad Wilson's Allied property truck. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small stage. Karen stood at the front with Wilson and another man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that didn't fit the small-town community center atmosphere. "Mark!" Karen's voice carried across the room with fake sweetness. "So glad you could make it." I took a seat in the back and watched neighbors file in. The Hendersons, looking worried. Mrs. Petrov with her granddaughter. Jake Rodriguez still in his fire department uniform. About 30 people total. Not the whole neighborhood, but enough to make this feel official. Wilson stepped up to a portable microphone. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Brad Wilson from Allied Property Management, and I want to thank you all for coming tonight to discuss some serious safety concerns that have come to our attention." He clicked a remote, and a projector screen descended from the ceiling. The first slide showed an aerial photograph of our neighborhood, with several properties highlighted in red. As you can see, we've identified multiple code violations and safety hazards that pose a risk to your community. Illegal commercial operations, improper chemical storage, fire hazards from unauthorized electrical work. My garage workshop appeared on screen, photographed from above. Someone in the audience gasped. "Now, I know change can be difficult," Wilson continued, "but Allied Property is prepared to offer a solution that benefits everyone. We're proposing to purchase affected properties at above-market rates, allowing residents to relocate while we address these safety concerns through proper commercial development." The room erupted, voices raised, people standing, chairs scraping against linoleum. Mrs. Henderson stood up first. "This is our home. We've lived here for 23 years. And we want to keep it safe," Wilson replied smoothly, "which is why we're offering fair market value plus a 20% premium for voluntary relocation." 20% premium. For people on fixed incomes, that was real money. I could see some neighbors wavering, doing math in their heads. That's when Karen took the microphone. "I know this is hard to hear, but we have to think about our children, about property values, about what happens when commercial operations start bringing truck traffic through residential streets." She looked directly at me. "Mark Chandler's garage workshop is just the beginning. If we don't act now, this whole neighborhood could be zoned commercial within a year." The crowd turned to stare at me. I felt that familiar weight in my chest, the same feeling I'd had when I had to explain my risk assessment failure to a boardroom full of executives. But this time, I had something I didn't have back then. I had the truth. I stood up slowly, my father's calipers still in my pocket. "Karen, can I ask you a question?" Her smile faltered. "Of course." "When did you first become concerned about my workshop?" "Well, the noise has been..." "Because I've been operating that workshop for 3 years. I've fixed your laptop twice, your neighbor's printer, taught your nephew how to solder. When did it become a safety hazard?" The room was dead quiet now. "Mark, this isn't about personal..." Wilson started to interrupt. "No, I think it is personal," I said, pulling out my phone. "It's personal when someone flies a drone over my property without permission. It's personal when someone cuts my power without notice. And it's really personal when I find out Allied Property Management filed development plans for this neighborhood 6 months before they discovered these alleged safety violations." I held up my phone, showing the photographed documents. "Would you like to explain to everyone why your company needs to acquire 12 specific properties to build luxury condominiums? Or should I read from your own development proposal?" Wilson's face went white. Karen looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. "You've all been lied to," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "This isn't about safety. It's about money. $15 million worth of waterfront development that requires clearing out every family in this room. Mrs. Petrov stood up, her voice shaky but clear. Is this true? Are you trying to steal our homes? The silence stretched until it felt like a held breath. Finally, Wilson cleared his throat. Mr. Chandler, you're making some serious accusations. I'm sharing public records, I shot back. Everything I just said is filed with the county planning office. Anyone can look it up. That's when Jake Rodriguez raised his hand. Mark, you said waterfront development. We're half a mile from the lake. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. That's the interesting part, Jake. We're half a mile from the current shoreline. But according to the flood projection maps Allied filed with their development proposal, climate change is going to make our neighborhood lakefront property within the next decade. The room exploded again, but this time the anger was pointed in a different direction. I watched Wilson and Karen exchange glances, saw the exact moment they realized their carefully planned meeting had just become a public relations disaster. But I also saw something else in Wilson's expression, something that told me this was far from over. Because when people are playing for $15 million, they don't just give up and go home. They get creative. The meeting broke up in chaos, with Wilson and Karen beating a hasty retreat, while neighbors clustered around me asking questions I couldn't answer yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I'd just painted a target on my back the size of a $15 million development deal. I was right. 3 days later, I woke up to flashing red and blue lights outside my bedroom window. The smell of diesel exhaust and autumn frost cut through the morning air as I stumbled to the front door in my bathrobe. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch. Behind them, a county code enforcement truck and what looked like a hazmat team. Mark Chandler? The older deputy's badge read Martinez. No relation to Karen, I hoped. We have a warrant to inspect your property for environmental violations. Environmental violations? He handed me a folded paper. Anonymous tip about illegal chemical disposal. We need to check your garage and any outbuildings. My stomach dropped as I read the warrant. Suspected violations included improper storage of hazardous materials, illegal dumping of electronic waste, and contamination of groundwater. Each violation carried fines ranging from $5,000 to $20,000. I watched the hazmat team suit up like they were entering a nuclear reactor instead of a suburban garage where I fixed broken electronics. The deputy handed me a clipboard. You'll need to sign this waiver acknowledging that any equipment we deem hazardous will be confiscated pending environmental testing. How long does that testing take? Could be months. Depends on the backlog at the state lab. Months. They were going to tie up my equipment for months while I fought charges that would bankrupt me even if I won. I signed the waiver because I didn't have a choice, then stood in my driveway watching strangers in white suits bag up my 3D printer, my soldering station, my testing equipment, everything I needed to make a living. The bottles of distilled water I used for cleaning circuit boards, potential environmental contamination, the old computer parts I saved for teaching kids about electronics, illegal e-waste storage, the small lithium batteries I kept for drone repairs, hazardous materials requiring special disposal permits. By noon, my garage looked like a crime scene, yellow tape, evidence markers, and a padlock on the door. That evening, Jake Rodriguez knocked on my front door with a 6-pack of beer and a grim expression. How bad is it? He asked, settling into my kitchen chair. Financially, I'm done. Even if I beat every charge, the legal fees alone will wipe me out. I opened a beer and took a long pull. They're systematic, Jake. Every time I find a way to fight back, they've already got the next move planned. So what are you going to do? I stared out my kitchen window at the garage that used to be my workshop, my livelihood, my connection to my father's memory. I'm going to do something they won't expect. Which is? I'm going to stop fighting their game and start playing my own. Jake raised an eyebrow. Meaning? I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken at the courthouse. Wilson said they need those flood projection maps for their development proposal. But here's what I realized today. I'm a risk assessment engineer. I model catastrophic failures for a living. So I know how to read hydraulic surveys. And Allied's flood projections, they're not just wrong, Jake, they're deliberately falsified. I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Look at these elevation markers. They show our neighborhood flooding during a 100-year storm event. but the actual topography data from the USGS shows we're sitting on high ground that hasn't flooded since 1952. Jake studied the papers. Why would they lie about flood risk? Because flood zone designation affects property values. If they can convince the county our neighborhood is at risk, they can get special development permits that bypass normal environmental review. Plus, they can buy properties cheap from people scared about flooding. I felt that familiar click in my brain, the same feeling I got when I found the critical failure point in a complex system. But here's the beautiful part. They filed these fake projections with the county as supporting documents for their development permit. Which means they've committed fraud in a government filing. That's not a civil matter anymore, Jake. That's criminal. I reached for my father's calipers, still sitting on the counter where I'd left them. My dad always said the best way to solve an electrical problem is to trace it back to the source, find where the voltage is coming from, and you can cut the whole system. And Allied Property Management is your voltage source. Allied is just the contractor. The real voltage is coming from whoever's financing a $15 million development deal based on fraudulent environmental data. That night, I called Professor Lin at the State University. Dr. Sarah Lin ran the hydrology department and owed me a favor from when I donated my flood modeling software to her graduate program. Mark, it's been months. How's the workshop business? Complicated. Sarah, I need a favor. Can you review some flood projection data for accuracy, strictly off the record? Of course. Email me what you've got. I sent her Allied's flood projections along with the actual USGS topography data. Her response came back within 2 hours. Mark, these projections are completely fabricated. Whoever created them either has no idea how hydraulic modeling works, or they're deliberately trying to deceive someone. Where did you get this? I stared at her email for a long time, thinking about chess games and electrical circuits and the difference between playing defense and playing to win. Then I made a phone call that would change everything. County Prosecutor's Office, how can I help you? I'd like to report a case of development fraud involving falsified environmental data. The woman on the other end of the line sounded suddenly interested. Can you hold for Detective Morrison? He handles our white-collar crime division. As I waited on hold, I looked out at my sealed garage and thought about my father, about how he'd taught me that every electrical system has a weak point. And if you apply pressure in exactly the right place, the whole thing comes apart. Tomorrow, I was going to start applying pressure. But tonight, something was bothering me, a feeling that I was still missing a piece of the puzzle. Because in my experience, when people go to this much trouble to acquire specific properties, it's usually not about what they want to build. It's about what's already there. Detective Morrison turned out to be a compact man with sharp eyes and the kind of patience that comes from investigating financial crimes for 15 years. We met at a diner outside town, away from prying eyes and neighborhood gossip. Mr. Chandler, I've reviewed the documents you provided. The falsified flood data is definitely prosecutable, but I need to understand the bigger picture here. He stirred sugar into his coffee, the spoon clinking against ceramic. Walk me through everything from the beginning. I told him about the drone, the code violations, the HOA meeting, the environmental raid. Morrison took notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood exactly what Allied was trying to pull. Here's what I don't get, he said finally. All this effort to acquire 12 specific properties for a waterfront development that won't be waterfront for another decade. Why not just wait? Why risk fraud charges? That was the question that had been keeping me awake at night. I think there's something about our properties they need right now, something they can't get anywhere else. Like what? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. Morrison closed his notebook. Mr. Chandler, I want you to know that opening a fraud investigation could take months. In the meantime, Allied can continue pressuring your neighbors to sell. How long do we have before they get what they need? Based on their permit filings, they need to acquire at least 12 properties before the end of the year to maintain their development timeline. That gives us about 2 months. 2 months to take down a $15 million development scheme, no pressure. I drove home through streets that felt different now. Not like a neighborhood, but like a battlefield, where I was still fighting the last war while my opponents had moved on to the next one. That evening, Tommy Chen knocked on my door. The 16-year-old from next door had been one of my best students in the weekend robotics classes I used to teach in my garage. Mr. Chandler, my mom said I should talk to you about something weird I saw. What kind of weird, Tommy? Last week, when those hazmat guys were at your house, I was up in my room doing homework, and I saw them taking pictures of stuff that wasn't in your garage. I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of stuff? The storm drain behind your house, the old utility poles, that concrete thing by your back fence. They spent like 20 minutes measuring it and taking pictures. The concrete thing. I'd never paid much attention to it. Just an old survey marker or utility access point, partially buried under years of fallen leaves. Tommy, you still have that metal detector we built for your science project? Yeah, why? Want to help me with some field work? An hour later, we were in my backyard with Tommy's homemade metal detector, sweeping the area around that concrete marker. The device started beeping before we'd even cleared the leaves away. Mr. Chandler, there's a lot of metal down there, like a lot. I borrowed a shovel from my neighbor and started digging. 6 inches down, I hit something hard. Not concrete, cast iron. Tommy, go get Jake Rodriguez. Tell him to bring his heavy-duty flashlight. 20 minutes later, the three of us were staring at what I'd uncovered. A cast iron access cover, about 3 feet square, with markings that made my heart race. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1943, Jake read from the corroded metal plate. Mark, what is this thing? I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for Army Corps of Engineers 1943 infrastructure. What I found made everything suddenly, terrifyingly clear. It's a utility tunnel, I said, built during World War II to supply power and communications to the radar installation that used to be on the lakefront. There was a radar installation here? 12 miles of underground tunnels connecting a dozen access points throughout this area. The military decommissioned it in 1955, but the tunnels are still there. Jake's flashlight beam penetrated about 20 feet into the tunnel before disappearing into darkness. The air that came up smelled like damp concrete and decades of stillness. This is what they're after, I said, pieces clicking together in my mind. Not the surface land for development, the subsurface rights, the tunnel system. Tommy looked confused. Why would someone want old military tunnels? I thought about fiber optic cables and data centers, about tech companies paying millions for secure underground facilities, about how a private entity could lease defunct military infrastructure for a fraction of what it would cost to build new. Because 12 miles of climate-controlled underground space, 15 minutes from the state capitol, is worth a lot more than $15 million in condominiums. Jake whistled low. How much more? Try $150 million, maybe more, if they can get exclusive access rights to the entire tunnel system. We stood there in the growing darkness, flashlight beams playing over the entrance to a secret that Allied Property Management would commit fraud to protect. I felt that familiar electrical buzz in my brain, the sensation of finding the critical failure point in a complex system. But this time, I wasn't looking at a risk assessment. I was looking at a weapon. Tommy, I need you to do me a favor. Can you map where all these access points are located? Use that GPS app on your phone. Mark every concrete structure you can find in the neighborhood. Sure, but why? Because tomorrow morning, I'm going to make a phone call that's going to change everything. As we covered the tunnel entrance back up, I thought about my father and his electrical troubleshooting methods, about how sometimes the best way to fix a system is to overload it completely. Allied Property Management was about to discover that some neighbors fight back harder than others. And some neighbors know exactly where to apply the pressure to bring down the whole operation. The streetlights flickered on as we walked back to the house, casting long shadows across a battlefield that was about to shift in ways Brad Wilson and Karen Martinez never saw coming. The next morning, I made the most important phone call of my life. Federal Bureau of Investigation, how may I direct your call? I need to report the theft of decommissioned military infrastructure. That got their attention fast. Agent Sarah Walsh arrived at my house 3 hours later, along with a military historian from the Pentagon and someone from the Corps of Engineers who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I showed them everything. The tunnel access point, Tommy's GPS coordinates of 12 other concrete structures throughout the neighborhood, the falsified flood data, Allied's development plans, and the connection between subsurface rights and a $150 million infrastructure grab. Mr. Chandler, Agent Walsh said, studying the tunnel entrance. These facilities were never officially decommissioned. According to our records, they're still classified as strategic defense infrastructure. The Corps of Engineers representative nodded grimly, which means accessing them without authorization is a federal crime. Attempting to acquire them through fraudulent real estate transactions is conspiracy to commit theft of government property. How big of a crime are we talking about? 25 years in federal prison kind of crime. That afternoon, Brad Wilson and Karen Martinez were arrested at Allied Property Management's offices. The local news crews were there to film Wilson doing a perp walk in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking a lot less impressive with federal marshals on either side. But here's the thing about justice. It's never as clean as you hope it'll be. The federal investigation froze all of Allied's assets, including the money they'd already paid to the 3 families who'd agreed to sell. Those families were stuck in legal limbo, having sold their homes but unable to access the proceeds. Mrs. Henderson developed stress-related health problems that landed her in the hospital twice. My workshop equipment still tied up in evidence while the county decided whether to drop the environmental charges. My electronics repair business was gone, my teaching income vanished, and my reputation in the community was split between neighborhood hero and troublemaker who brought the feds to town. I had to sell my house anyway. Not to Allied Property Management, obviously, but to pay the legal bills and medical expenses that accumulated during 6 months of fighting a system designed to crush people like me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that I'd saved the neighborhood by leaving it. But here's what they don't tell you in the movies about taking on the powerful interests. Sometimes winning costs you everything you were fighting to protect. 3 months later, I was living in a small apartment across town, working as a consultant for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, helping them unravel similar schemes in other communities. The pay was good, the work was meaningful, and I was using my risk assessment skills to protect people instead of just analyzing their problems. Tommy Chen visited me there on a Saturday afternoon, carrying a small cardboard box. "Mr. Chandler, I thought you should have these back." Inside were my father's calipers, returned by the county after all charges were dropped. Tommy had kept them safe during the investigation, knowing what they meant to me. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said, holding the steel tools that had measured voltage and resistance in my father's hands, then guided me to the truth about Allied's scheme. "My dad always said these were for finding problems. Turns out they're pretty good for solving them too. Are you going to keep teaching robotics?" "Different kind of teaching now, but yeah, I'm still in the problem-solving business." That evening, I got a text message from Jake Rodriguez. "Community Center approved funding for new makerspace. Need someone to run weekend classes. Interested?" I looked out my apartment window at a sunset that painted the sky the color of possibilities, then typed back, "When do I start?" Because sometimes losing everything you think you want is how you find out what you actually need. And sometimes the best way to protect a community is to show them they're stronger than the people trying to tear them apart. 6 months later, Detective Morrison called to tell me that Allied Property Management's parent company had been indicted in 14 states for similar schemes. The investigation I'd started by refusing to let them steal my garage had uncovered a nationwide conspiracy worth over $2 billion. My workshop was gone, my house was gone, and I'd never be the same trusting neighbor I used to be. But you know what? I'd learned something my father never taught me about electrical systems. Sometimes the most important thing you can measure isn't voltage or resistance. Sometimes it's knowing exactly how much pressure the system can take before it breaks, and applying that pressure right where it counts. The Maple Street Community Makerspace opened last month, funded by federal grants and housed in the old community center. Every Saturday morning, you'll find me there with a new group of kids, teaching them how to build robots and solve problems and measure things that matter. And yes, I still carry my father's calipers, because you never know when you're going to need to find the source of the problem.